Chapter 1. Albert Dailey stood leaning on the fence that separated his property from his father's. Unlike his father before him, he wanted to raise beef cattle, while his father had raised some. His real desire had only been to train horses. His younger brothers seemed to be following in their pa's footsteps, but Albert was all about the beef cattle. His stepmother, Susan, walked toward him, holding the hand of his youngest half-sister. "Hey there," she called. "You look lost in thought." He sighed. "I am." He took the baby from her, hugging her close. He had moved out of the house with his family and now had a small house on his own land adjoining his father's, but all of his younger siblings still loved him. "Just thinking that I never have time to go into town and meet any ladies. Kinda thinking it's time for me to marry and have a couple kids of my own. Just don't have 6 like your father and I have," Susan said with a laugh. "And we had 4 before we were even married." He grinned. "What would you think about me sending a letter to Aunt Elizabeth about a wife?" He knew his aunt, whom he'd only met once, was a matchmaker back in Beckham, Massachusetts, where his stepmother had come from. "I think that's a good idea. Maybe she'll send you one of the demon horde," she said with a smile. Her younger siblings had been referred to as the demon horde since she was about 10. After her first 4 children, her mother had let her brothers and sisters run wild, though there'd been a new baby every 16 months or so. Albert laughed. "That would be awesome. Imagine the pranks our children would pull." He and his brother Louis had been quite the pranksters when they'd been younger, until Susan had married their father and put a stop to all their shenanigans. Susan groaned. "No demon horde child for you. Seriously, I can't even imagine what would happen. That baby would be born pulling pranks." "I know." He grinned at her. "No, I won't request someone from the demon horde, but I think I will write to her. It worked out well for you and Pa." "It did. We've been happy for the past 14 years together. I'm sure Elizabeth will find someone just perfect for you to marry. I'll give you her address when you come home for supper tonight. I was planning on eating at my place. I know how well you cook." "We eat a 6, she reminded him, taking the baby back. "Clarissa and I are going to conquer the world today. That means we're going to play and play and play. Right, Clary?" Clarissa laughed and patted her mother's cheek. She was obviously in agreement. As Albert watched Susan walk away, he started envisioning the kind of woman who would get off the train to marry him. She would be beautiful, just like Susan, but more than that, she'd be smart, able to cook, and she'd have to love children. He felt something was missing in his life, and a wife and children would fill the void perfectly. He'd write to Aunt Elizabeth now and have the letter ready to go as soon as he found out where to mail it to. He couldn't wait to meet his wife. Asterisk. Alice Miller made the walk into town to work at the Mercantile. This was her 2nd year working there, and she hated the job. She hated the walk into Beckham every day, but more importantly, she hated the way people looked at her. It's not like she was still pulling pranks on people. She'd grown up to become a productive member of her community, but at 19, Alice had never been kissed. She'd never had a boy slip her a note in class about meeting him in the woods at lunchtime so they could kiss either. It was a lonely life, and she blamed it all on her reputation, which she blamed on herself. She shouldn't have gone along with all the pranks her older brothers had suggested. Her brothers were all miscreants, and they shouldn't have been allowed to influence younger children. At the store, she put her apron on, and she began putting the new stock on the shelves. It was the same thing every day. Arrive at 10, stock the shelves. Go behind the counter at noon, so the proprietor and his wife could eat a nice lunch together. Then she would have her own lunch, straighten the shelves, and make sure everything was where it belonged. At 4, she would sweep the entire store and the front stoop. At 5, she was off and made the long walk back home. Every single day. No changes. No excitement. Just boredom. She was still stocking the shelves when she heard a voice behind her. Alice, can you come to my house after work, so we can talk? Alice turned to see her older sister Elizabeth standing there. Elizabeth was the second eldest girl of the Miller clan, the two oldest were boys, and she'd always been well behaved. Why? Are you going to find me a husband, and let me go off to parts unknown to marry a stranger? Elizabeth laughed. Is that what you want me to do? It is. I know it sounds silly, but that's exactly what I want you to do. Then come see me for supper. I'll have Bernard ride out to let Ma know that you're spending the night with me. We'll talk, laugh, find you a husband, and have a little sister time. Alice laughed, flinging her arms around her sister. I knew you were here to save me from a life of banalness. What are sisters for? As soon as work was over, Alice headed toward her sister's house on Rock Creek Road. It seemed to Alice that her home could better be referred to as a mansion, but Elizabeth called it a house. Bernard came to the door as soon as she knocked. Your sister is in her office. You know the way? Alice nodded. I do know the way. Thanks, Bernard. The man intimidated Alice, but she just kept reminding herself that if he was scary, Elizabeth never would have married him. She walked down the hall and opened the first door on the left. Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked up from the baby she was nursing, a smile on her face. I'm going to finish feeding her while we talk if you don't mind. No problem. It's not like I haven't seen women nursing before. Now, why am I here? Well, the reason I invited you here is just a little odd. Susan's stepson Albert needs a wife, and he wrote to me asking me to find him one. It's a little odd with the family relation, but you've not only never met Albert, but he's not blood related to you. If you marry him, our sister will be your mother-in-law, but she'll also be there to help you with anything that comes along. Alice frowned for a moment, considering the situation. So even though he's our nephew, step-nephew, you think it would be all right for me to marry him? It seemed a little stranger than Elizabeth's usual matchups. I do think it's fine. I'm sure Susan would love to have one of her sisters there full-time. I understand his property borders Susan and David's. Elizabeth picked up a letter and handed it to Alice. Do you want to read what he has to say? Alice took the letter from her sister, flipping it over and over in her hands, before she finally opened it and read the contents. Dear Aunt Elizabeth. This letter may come as a surprise to you, but I'm out on my own now, and I'm in need of a wife. Susan tells me what a good matchmaker you are, and I would like to request your services in finding a bride for me. I have my own ranch, which borders Susan and Pa's. I'm a cattle rancher, and I don't do much with horse training like Pa does. There was a girl at church I was planning to ask to court, but I just found out she's getting married next week. No one else here appeals to me at all. So, help me find a good wife. I want someone who can cook, because I am terrible at it. She has to not mind the long hours a rancher puts in as he's starting out. And she must want children, because I can't imagine what life would be like without at least a dozen of them. If you can find this woman, I will be eternally grateful. I think Susan would be happy to have a friend or a sister from back home. And I must admit, I like the idea of marrying a member of the demon horde. Please let me know when to be in Fort Worth to fetch my bride. With great affection, Albert Dailey. Alice couldn't help but grin as she handed the letter back to her sister. It sounds like he's looking for me. That's exactly what I thought. How would you feel about moving to Texas and being Susan's neighbor? I barely remember Susan. I think I was about 5 when she left. That sounds about right. She was probably more of a mother to you than a sibling. Alice nodded. You both were. You were the only people who ever disciplined any of us. I know. Well, I think you should write to Albert and marry him. What do you think? Definitely. I'm excited to go to Texas, where it doesn't get cold like it does here. Alice had always imagined Texas as some sort of paradise, with palm trees and sandy beaches. The idea of moving there was like a dream come true. Elizabeth handed her a pen, a pot of ink, and a piece of paper. "Write to him. As soon as he wires back that he wants you to be his wife, I'll put you on a train west. I'm excited to see what will happen with the next generation when a Dailey boy marries one of the demon horde. It's like a horror story just waiting to be written." Alice laughed. "I wasn't the worst of the demon horde." "No, you weren't. That would have been Charlie. She was the worst out of all of us." Elizabeth sighed. "It's hard to send my siblings away, but it's not hard to understand that they won't find love and happiness here in Beckham. Not after their shenanigans when they were younger." "This is true. Now, hush. I'm writing my future husband." Alice had supper with Elizabeth and Bernard that evening, and they talked and laughed together. Alice couldn't stop thinking about the man she was going west to marry and his stepmother, her eldest sister. She didn't know Susan well enough to miss her, but from what she'd heard from other siblings, she would love her. And soon, she'd be going west to be near her. Asterisk. It was about 2 weeks later that a telegram came into Beckham accepting Alice as a bride for Albert. There was no message from Susan, and Alice couldn't help but wonder if Susan knew what was happening. Alice had given her notice at the store as soon as she'd talked to Elizabeth, not wanting to leave her employers hanging, and she hated the job with everything inside her, so she was happy to give it up. Packing her meager belongings and walking to town one last time to spend the night with Elizabeth before her early train the following morning, Alice felt a little skip in her step. Maybe she wasn't doing anything the normal way. She was marrying a man sight unseen, and she was going to be moving away from her family, but she didn't care. It was time for her to follow in her older siblings' footsteps and head west to marry a stranger. At least there would be no ready-made family waiting for her as Susan had found when she'd gone west to marry Albert's uncle. No, she'd be marrying a young man, not too much older than herself, and she would be able to keep house and live as God intended women to live. At Elizabeth's, she took the same room she'd taken just a couple of weeks before, and took everything upstairs to that room, and then she went down to spend a last day with her sister, brother-in-law, niece, and nephew. It wasn't a feeling of gloom and doom that permeated the air that evening. Instead, it was one of celebration. Sure, Elizabeth had a talk with her about making certain not to stay with a man who was mean to her in any way, but mostly, they laughed and joked, and Elizabeth made sure that Alice knew all about what would happen in the bedroom. Mother wasn't up to telling Susan or me, though we'd both figured it out long before watching the animals procreate. I'm not sure why a woman with a ridiculous number of children would be shy about how babies are made. Does she think we will always think of her and Pa? Elizabeth shuddered as she said the last words, and Alice laughed. I've seen the animals as well. I don't have any worries about what's going to happen on my wedding night. Besides, with it being a mail-order bride situation, I'm sure he won't expect it on the wedding night. Many men do, Elizabeth cautioned. I'm sure you can ask him to wait a week or two if that will make you feel more comfortable, but the truth is, you'll be living together in very close quarters, and the intimacy will probably be a bit difficult regardless. Alice sighed. Way to burst my bubble. I was certain everything would be absolutely perfect from the moment I arrived. Elizabeth shrugged. If you want to believe it's perfect, then that's what you should do. Live life wearing rose-colored glasses, and everything will feel like it's better than it really is. That's true. Alice thought on her sister's words for a moment. I guess I don't have to wake up and face reality as soon as I arrive, do I? Nope. Some people enjoy the scent of cow manure. Be one of those people, and you'll always find the bright side of things. I think you should plan to live happily ever after, so you don't risk becoming a malcontent. Sometimes happiness means that you choose to be happy, and you choose to look at life in a different way. You can know the truth, but still choose to look at it as if it's a golden opportunity. You'll be able to get to know your sister as an adult. You're leaving one family and going to another. Alice smiled. I like the way you think, Elizabeth Miller. That's Elizabeth Tandy to you. Elizabeth said with a smile. Just like in a short while, you'll be Alice Dailey. Alice Dailey. It has a nice ring to it. Chapter 2. Stepping off the train after her long trip, Alice's eyes scanned the crowd. She had no idea what Albert looked like, and she was anxious to meet the man she was about to marry. Well, as anxious as an exhausted woman could be. The movement of the train hadn't agreed with her stomach, and she'd spent a great deal of the trip green with nausea. Finally having her feet on solid land after what seemed like months and months of travel, she looked up into the bright March sun and took a deep breath. It wasn't the balmy weather she'd expected when setting foot in Texas, but it was much warmer with no snow on the ground. She couldn't complain about that at all. Finally, she spotted a young man with dark hair and eyes, who looked to be trying to spot someone as well. She walked to him carefully, smiling at the stranger. Are you Albert Dailey? His face lit up with excitement. No, I'm Louis Dailey. My brother had a heifer who was trying to deliver 2 babies this morning, and he was needed on the ranch. Are you Alice Miller? I am. So good to meet you, Louis. I'm surprised Susan isn't here to greet me. Louis laughed softly. Albert and I were amateur pranksters compared to you and your siblings growing up, but he thought we should play just one more trick. Well, more of a surprise really. Susan doesn't know it's you coming to marry Albert. We thought it would be fun if she had one of her siblings walk into her home and see if she could tell that you were kin. Alice covered her mouth with her hand to suppress the giggle that wanted to come out. So, I need to pretend that I don't know who she is? Got it. Albert was certain you'd go along with us, because it will be fun. Susan is expecting you to spend a night in her home in Albert's old room, and she wants to make sure you're good enough to marry Albert. Should be fun. Oh, most definitely. Where are your things? Louis asked. Alice held up 2 carpet bags. Right here. It's not like I needed to bring a lot with me. Of course, Alice also knew that the Dailey family was well off, and there was no need for her to spend her meager earnings trying to bring things from Massachusetts when it was easier to buy them all in Texas. She knew at one point it would have cost a great deal more to buy things in the West, but those days were in the past. Louis led her to his wagon and helped her up. Alice didn't tell him she used to jump out of trees into unsuspecting farmers' wagons as they drove along under her family's trees, and she could make a moving mount on a horse. Why should she? It was time for her to be grown and act like a lady, instead of like the young hooligan she'd once been. Once in the wagon, he drove down a road there in the middle of Fort Worth, Texas, describing everything around them. At one point, he pointed in a direction and said, "That's Hell's Half-Acre. You never want to go there." Alice was intrigued. Why not? It's where all the brothels and saloons are. Well, the worst of them. There are others, but nothing quite compares to Hell's Half-Acre. My uncle was killed investigating a prostitute's death there. I'm sorry for your loss. I miss my uncle, but I have to say, Susan never would have married my dad if Uncle Jesse had survived, which means I'd probably still be running wild tying teachers into outhouses and then pulling the outhouse over. Did you put snakes in the teacher's desk drawers? Only on days we were feeling kind, Louis said, grinning at her. She laughed. Sounds like we have a lot of notes to compare. I think Albert is secretly hoping that a merger between the Dailey boys and the demon horde will produce children who are able to come up with pranks that will change the world. It never even occurred to me he wanted to have prankster children. In my family, we grow out of it, and then have a difficult time holding our heads up in public, because we know how shameful everyone finds us. Alice sighed. We did have fun though. Once all 8 of us who were school age were suspended at the same time. We had so much fun during that week off school. I think my mother was ready to actually discipline us for a minute or two. Louis laughed. Albert and I would have been thrilled. Susan had some stories about your behavior that even we had a hard time believing was true. Oh, if Susan said it, it's true. She and Elizabeth were the perfect daughters. They cooked, cleaned, took care of all of us, and they even worked jobs outside the home to help the family out. Sometimes I think if it hadn't been for Susan and Elizabeth, we'd all still be running wild. We got to meet Aunt Elizabeth a few years back. She was really nice, and I really liked Uncle Bernard. This may be where things get strange. I think of Elizabeth as my big sister, and here you are calling her Aunt. Do you call Susan by her name, or is she Ma? Albert and I never got into the habit of calling her Ma, but our younger brothers do. The twins? He nodded. Though there are other twins, of course. Susan had twins as well. She smiled. There's only one set of twins in my family. They painted the cow purple once. And they put newspaper under it so they wouldn't get the barn floor dirty. Louis said with a laugh. I guess you've heard that story. Alice liked this young man, and for just a moment, she thought it might be nice to marry him. Of course, she wasn't there for that, so she shoved the thought from her mind. The drive out to the Dailey family ranch was a long one, but she and Louis kept each other entertained with stories of their childish misdeeds. Louis pointed out important things, and they passed the time quickly. When they pulled in beside the house, Louis put on the parking brake. There was another young man approaching the wagon, though he looked as if he might be a year or two older than Louis. He walked to Alice's side of the wagon and helped her down. Did Louis fill you in on how we're playing this? He whispered. Alice nodded, her eyes twinkling as she met her future husband for the first time. He did. We'll have fun. How's your heifer? She's all right. One of the babies doesn't seem to have much strength, but I'll watch her for a few days to see what happens. It won't break me to lose one of the babies, but I'd have been sad to lose the heifer. It's nice to meet you, Albert. Alice felt stupid for not saying that first, but she was a farmer's daughter, and she knew the importance of each and every cow. He grinned, his brown eyes twinkling with laughter. And it's nice to meet you, Alice. She knows my name is Alice, right? She asked, her voice lowered. He nodded. Everything is the truth, except your last name is Moore. Got it. A blonde woman came out of the house with a baby on her hip. She walked over to Alice and looked her up and down. You remind me of someone, she said, her eyes narrowing. Well, from what Mrs. Tandy tells me, we're both from the same town. Perhaps you knew one of my older sisters. Susan frowned, pursing her lips. Perhaps. With one more skeptical look at Alice, Susan said, Come with me. I have a room made up for you. I thought we'd have a small wedding ceremony in the morning here at the ranch. The pastor said he'd come by around 10, and I've invited a few locals to join us. I'd like that a lot, Alice said sweetly, smiling at her sister. She looked in the back of the wagon, but both of her carpet bags were gone, and then she saw Louis with one and Albert with the other. Would you mind if I cleaned up a bit? My stomach didn't like that train one bit. Susan gave her a sympathetic glance. I remember when I came here, I helped a woman with her little boy, and I got off the train covered in vomit only to find that my fiancé was dead, and his brother wanted to marry me. It was not the way I wanted to arrive in Fort Worth. I can understand that perfectly. I don't think I would have enjoyed getting off the train to all of that either. Alice followed her sister, smiling at her little niece in Susan's arms. What's the baby's name? She knew it was Clarissa, but there was no way she was giving up her connection this early in the game. Clarissa. I think she's my last. I had 4 children instantly when I married David, and then I've had 6 more. Thankfully, there have been a few girls in the mix, and it hasn't always been mischievous boys. I do believe girls can be mischievous too. Why, there's a family in my town who have a whole lot of children, and the townspeople call them the demon horde. Isn't that name perfectly awful? Those would be my siblings, Susan said, smiling sweetly. Oops. I probably shouldn't have said that to you, should I? I forget that Mrs. Tandy told me I was coming to marry her stepnephew. Alice turned around and winked at Albert and Louis, already feeling like they were on the same team. Tricking Susan was going to be fun. Don't worry about it. I'm just glad I'm not back in Beckham to watch their misdeeds any longer. Susan led the way up a flight of stairs, with Alice, Albert, and Louis trailing along behind her like little ducklings who were following their mother duck to water. This will be your room for the night. We have a bathroom, and I'll show that to you after you've put your things down. I'll even help you dress for the wedding if you'd like. Oh, I'd enjoy that a great deal. Good. I'll leave you and Albert to get to know one another then. Leave the door open. There will be no canoodling between unmarried people under my roof. As soon as Susan was out of earshot, Alice whispered to Louis and Albert, I don't think she's on to us, but she is suspicious. Louis grinned. I'm so glad I get to play along with this one. One last prank before my brother becomes an old married man and boring. I have a feeling your brother will never be boring, Alice whispered. Albert smiled. I was a little worried you'd given yourself away when you mentioned the demon horde, but Susan took it in stride. I told her I needed to marry one of the demon horde. Alice laughed. I like to think I've graduated from the demon horde, but one last prank never hurt anyone. She sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. You two should skedaddle. I'm going to find clean clothes and get a bath. I truly feel like every bit of dust the train drove me through is now covering my body. Albert caught his brother's eye and nodded toward the door, then sat down beside Alice as soon as his brother had left. I'm glad you're here, he said softly. All silliness aside, I've been praying for you to arrive safe and healthy. And I have. We Millers are a hardy stock. He smiled. I've heard Susan say that more times than I can count. I'm sure you have. Before I go, may I kiss you? I want to know what it's like to kiss the woman I will be spending my life with. Alice pursed her lips for a moment. I guess so, but I'm pretty disgusting at the moment. You should probably wait until I've had time to bathe and clean my teeth. He sighed. I should. Instead of waiting, though, he pressed his lips to hers. It was a light kiss, but more than enough to make Alice's toes curl. I'll walk with you after supper. Alice watched him leave and touched her fingers to her lips. He was going to be a good husband. She could already feel it deep inside her. Reaching for her bags, she found a clean change of clothes and her hairbrush before heading downstairs to ask Susan where the bath was. Mrs. Dailey? I was hoping you'd show me to the room where I may bathe. Susan nodded briskly, handing the baby off. Please take care of putting Clarissa down for her nap, Mrs. Hackenschleimer. I need to show my future daughter-in-law to the bathroom. Bathroom? Alice asked, doing her best to sound surprised. You have a bathroom? I do. Susan led Alice into the bathroom and showed her how to work the faucet. My husband put this in for his first wife, and I have to say, I benefited from it far more than she ever did. Alice smiled. It's lovely. Thank you. After the bath, you may want to take a nap. It's still a few hours until supper. Have you eaten? Alice nodded. I had a sandwich on the train shortly before my stop. It was one of the few things she hadn't thrown up in the past week. Good. I'll see you at supper then. If you're not awake, I'll send one of the children up to knock on your door. Thank you, Mrs. Dailey. As soon as Susan had left her alone, Alice brushed out her hair. She always preferred it to be brushed before a bath, finding it was easier to manage that way. It was hard to remember to call her sister Mrs. Dailey, but she was glad she was getting to spend time with someone who had once meant so much to her. After her bath, she decided that Susan was right. She'd slept little on her long journey, not able to sleep with the jostling of the train along the track. She wished it had been an easier trip for her, but it didn't matter. Now she was in Texas, and she was with the man she was meant to marry and her eldest sister. Hopefully, Susan would take the one last prank well, and they would be able to start becoming close as sisters and not just as new in-laws. Alice was determined to be happy here, in this little part of Texas. It may not be the Wild West like where Charlie had settled up in Montana, but it was still a special place for her to be. Home. It was where she'd spend the rest of her days. Chapter 3. Alice was unsure how much later it was when there was a knock at her door. She struggled to climb out of the clouds of sleep and called out, "Yes?" "It's supper time," a child's voice responded. Alice sat up and rubbed her eyes, trying to get her head clear. She looked around. She was in Texas. She was there to get married and start a new life standing. She walked to the pitcher and bowl and poured a small amount of water to wash her face and quickly braided her hair in a single braid down her back. She didn't look her best, but at that moment, she couldn't let herself care too terribly much. She found her way to the dining room and sat in the empty chair beside Albert. The family had obviously all been waiting on her, and David, whom she had yet to be introduced to, prayed over their meal. After the prayer, they all passed food around, and she counted the children at the table. She smiled at the twins, identical, that Susan had inherited upon marrying David, and then she looked at the two little girls of the same age, also twins, but the two of them looked similar but were not identical. David smiled at her. "You must be Alice." "I'm David. Your brother-in-law and soon-to-be father-in-law, which is going to make things a bit strange." Alice looked between Albert and Louis, both looking as surprised as she felt. "How did you guess?" He chuckled. "You look exactly as my wife did when she got off the train. She told me you seemed familiar, but she couldn't place you. As soon as I saw you, I knew." Susan shook her head. "Did Albert and Louis tell you not to tell me I was your sister?" Alice shrugged. "It sounded like a fun little game to play with you." Susan sighed. "It's not going to be good to have a demon horde member married to a Dailey boy. I can feel it in my bones." She shook her head. "Welcome, little sister. I think you were what? 5 when I left home?" "I think so." Alice smiled at her sister. "I'm really excited that I get to spend time with you now." Susan smiled. "I am too, to be honest. It seems strange that you're marrying one of my sons, but there's no blood between you, so why not?" Alice grinned. "I'm just glad you're not mad at me for it." "Not at all. Only at those 2 sons of mine who think everything is funny." Alice nudged her leg against Albert's under the table, and he grinned at her. "Sorry, Susan." Louis followed suit. "Sorry, Susan." "No, you're not. Neither one of you were sorry for a thing. You thought it was fun, so you did it. It's how you are, even after all these years." Susan looked at Alice. "I know Ma has said this to you 1,000 times, but I hope you have one just like you." Alice laughed. "She said that to all of us. Did you get one just like you?" Susan nodded. "I think that would be Clarissa. Only time will tell." Alice took her first bite of fried chicken and smiled. "Better than Ma ever made. I don't have time to cook with all the children. I only cook on occasion. Usually, Mrs. Hackenschleimer takes care of the meals, and I take care of the little ones. But we both do a little bit of everything." "Oh, I saw her earlier," Alice said. "She doesn't eat with you?" Susan sighed. I have, after 14 years with her, convinced her to eat with the family when there are no guests present. I tried to convince her that you were family and not a guest, but she wasn't willing to listen. So, she's eating all alone in the kitchen. Alice frowned. That's not right. I told her she is family, but she won't believe that either. I don't know why she wants to keep distance between us, but she seems determined to do so. Susan shrugged. It'll be all right. She knows the children love her as if she's their grandmother. Ma wouldn't like that much. She thinks she should get to play with her grandkids. Well, now that Ida May is in school, it kind of makes sense that she's ready for grandkids. I'm sure Elizabeth shares her children, as does Mary. Alice nodded. Everyone else is scattered to the winds. I expect Ma to take a switch to Elizabeth any day for sending away all of her children as soon as they're old enough to bring her grandbabies. Susan laughed at that. Elizabeth and I have both been switched, but you little ones never received the kind of discipline you needed. Oh, Elizabeth had some clever punishments she came up with when we were particularly poorly behaved. After supper, Alice offered to help with the dishes, but Susan shook her head. No, you go and walk with Albert. You two need to get to know each other a bit before the ceremony tomorrow. She looked at Albert sternly. Notice I said a bit. Don't make me trail along behind the two of you, telling you that you're touching too much. Albert grinned. Hey, I'm marrying her tomorrow. What more do you want from me? For you to be a gentleman until you say I do. After that, I'm not worried about it because you won't be my responsibility. You'll be hers. As the two of them left the house together, Alice grinned at Albert. Susan doesn't trust you as far as she can throw you. Oh, that's not true. She's just annoyed that we didn't tell her who you are. No big deal. It was good, though, wasn't it? Alice laughed. I certainly enjoyed it. I thought we could walk over so you can see our house. Susan and Mrs. Hackenschleimer made certain it was clean enough for a wife to be brought into. That was kind of them, Alice said, feeling a little shy now that she was alone with Albert. I'm looking forward to keeping house. Really? Does anyone really enjoy keeping house? Alice smiled. It's so much better than the store where I was working back in Beckham. I did all the stocking, all the cleaning. It will be nice to clean something and know that if someone trudges mud inside, I'll know who it is and have the right to raise my voice to them. Aw, man. Are you going to be yelling at me about muddy floors? Not if you don't make them muddy, Alice said reasonably. He led them to a house less than half the size of his father's. It's not much, but I think it's perfect for us to start a family in. She nodded. It looks like it. Albert led her inside, showing her the kitchen and the parlor. It's only got 3 bedrooms, but Pa helped me put in a bathroom, just like we had at home. Alice clapped her hands together. I'm so excited to have a bathroom. I cannot tell you what a treat it's always been to go visit Elizabeth, and now I'll have one too. It's like a dream come true. He chuckled, taking her by the waist and pulling her toward him. Well, then I think I deserve a kiss for thinking about it, don't you? She smiled, stepping closer to him. I think I could manage that. I wondered for so long how it would be to kiss the man I'm marrying, and I'm so happy to find out. I did kiss you earlier. Not the same thing. Anyone could have walked up then. Fine. First real kiss then. He slowly leaned toward her and lowered his mouth to hers, pressing a light kiss against her lips. Alice couldn't be content with such a soft kiss, so she wrapped her arms around his neck, and she slowly opened her mouth under his, returning the kiss. Albert lifted his head, giving her a surprised look, before leaning down to kiss her again, this time deepening the kiss immediately, his hand stroking her shoulders and down her back. When his hand cupped her breast, she broke the kiss and stepped back. I think this is what Susan was worried would happen. Susan's a smart woman, he said, panting slightly. All right, let's look at the rest of the house. He led her to 2 bedrooms, with a door open between them. I figured the extra room could be for a baby. Perfect. And there's a room upstairs for when they get a little older, she asked. Yes. I'll show you. He led her up the stairs, and the room she saw was huge. We could even put up a wall if we don't want boys and girls sharing a room. That would be wise, Alice said. Back home there were several bedrooms, and we all rotated between them. I've never had a room to myself except on rare occasions, and I'm excited to have my own room for just one night. I guess that means you're not going to complain about sharing my bed straight off? Alice shook her head. Why bother? We both know where everything leads to, and I really like kissing you. I don't think lovemaking will be a chore with you. Glad to hear it. Albert shook his head. You are definitely not the shy girl I was expecting. Shy? You expected a girl from the demon horde to be shy? With the pranks we pulled? I guess I didn't think it through very well, he said. I was expecting you to be like the girl I couldn't get up the nerve to ask out. Because you're a little shy? He chuckled. I wouldn't say that. Good. Then we're pretty evenly matched. As they walked back to Susan's house, they talked about what they wanted in the future. Do you want lots of kids? He asked. Alice nodded. I wouldn't know what to do if I only had 1 or 2. I wouldn't either. I don't think having 10 children was in Susan's plans, but it worked out for me. I love having a lot of siblings. If I remember correctly, Susan left because she didn't want to spend another moment with poorly behaved children, so she moved to Texas and became your stepmother. Alice laughed softly. I feel badly for her, but things happen for a reason. I know they do, he said. I don't want to think about the kind of person I would have ended up being if not for Susan. He kissed her once more, before taking her into the house. This kiss was filled with longing, and the knowledge they would be able to deal with that longing the following evening. I'm glad we're marrying quickly. I am as well. She smiled at him, glad Elizabeth had come to find her at work and suggest she marry a stranger. Let's go inside or Susan will send out a search party. As soon as the door opened, they could hear laughter. All the children were in the parlor with Susan and David, including Louis. He grinned at Alice and Albert as they walked in. Did he show you the house? Susan asked. Alice sank down onto the floor, making sure her skirt was arranged neatly around her. He did. I love it. I think there should be a wall separating the upstairs into 2 rooms, but everything else is perfect. I don't know what kind of stove Ma uses these days, but I know the one I used growing up is very different than the one in Albert's house. If you need help learning to use it, just let me know. Thank you. Alice smiled. I hope we can spend some time together and really get to know one another. It feels strange that I have a sister who is a virtual stranger to me. David nodded. Especially with how much alike you two look. What does that have to do with anything? Susan asked. Well, you'd think that you'd be close, looking alike and everything. Susan met Alice's eyes, and she shrugged. I guess that makes sense in a David sort of way. It does. David said. And don't you forget it. Alice liked the atmosphere in the home even more than the building itself. Sure, it was a beautiful home, but more than that, Susan and David had raised their children there, and still were. Alice could just feel the love in the home. What time will we have the wedding tomorrow? She knew Susan had told her, but she couldn't remember what her sister had said. I told everyone to be here at 10. That gives us time to get you in a pretty dress and to have food made for everyone to eat while they're here. Susan smiled. It's hard to believe my sister is marrying my son. It just sounds wrong. Alice nodded. It may sound wrong, but it's not. I share no blood with Albert, and we never set eyes on one another before today. And she'd never been attracted to a man the way she was to Albert. She didn't know if it was the power of suggestion or what, but she met him, and it all just sort of clicked into place. That's true. Susan studied her sister. I have a dress that I think would be perfect for you to wear. It's one I made shortly after we married, and after 6 children, I'll never fit into it again, but you're welcome to try it on. I didn't take the time to make myself a dress for the wedding, though I bought some fabric so I could make new clothes when I arrived. If you have something for the wedding, I would be eternally grateful. Susan nodded, getting to her feet. Clarissa looked up to see her mother standing and raised her arms to be picked up. Stooping down to get her daughter, Susan led the way up the stairs to her own bedroom. Once there, she handed Alice her niece, and knelt on the floor to open a chest full of clothes. She dug deep and found a dress at the very bottom. This is the one. She stood and held it up in front of her. What do you think? I love it. Do you think it will fit? Alice desperately wanted to wear the dress. It was made of silk and had lace around the wrists and neck. Susan set the dress on the bed, taking Clarissa back. There's only one way to find out. Alice quickly stripped and tried the dress on, looking at herself in the mirror above Susan's dresser. It's perfect. Oh, Susan, I love it. May I wear it? I'll be ever so careful. Susan laughed. I have many other dresses. That one is your wedding gift from me. Alice threw her arms around Susan and the baby. Thank you. You're the best sister ever. We'll see if you still say that when I start acting like a mother-in-law. Chapter 4. Alice slept like a rock that night. She woke up after 8 in the morning to Susan telling her she had to get ready for the wedding, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept so late. She was normally up before dawn. She swung her legs out of bed and looked at her sister with bleary eyes. I wish we could put off the wedding for one more day, and you and I could just spend some time just being sisters. Honestly, I'd like that too. If I'd known you were my sister before coming, I'd have ensured we had at least a week, but I've already invited too many people to postpone things now. Susan sat beside Alice on the bed. You're not getting nervous, are you? About the wedding night? Alice laughed. I think I'm even more eager for that than Albert is. It's not that. It's just that I've always known I had this big sister who lived far away, and now I get to meet her, but we don't get to spend as much time together as I would like. That makes sense, Susan said. We'll still be right next door to each other, and you'll be able to visit whenever you'd like. And I'll come visit you as well. Maybe we can even talk Ma and Pa into coming out here now that we're both here. I doubt it, Alice said. Ma told me that we can all go off and marry as long as we write to her, and we understand that any visiting must be done by the children and not the parents. Well, I guess that answers that, doesn't it? Susan stood up. I let you sleep later than I should have. I kept your breakfast warm, but you need to hurry if you want to be ready by the time people start arriving. Alice nodded, getting to her feet. She was glad she'd bathed the night before. After I eat, will you help me with my hair? Susan looked torn for a moment, but she finally nodded. I will. I shouldn't, because I should be playing hostess, but I'll let Mrs. H handle that. Am I allowed to call her Mrs. H as well? That name is so long and complicated. Absolutely. Come on, let's get you fed. Alice ate quickly while Susan dealt with Clarissa. She seemed to be very needy to Alice, but Susan didn't seem to mind. She seemed genuinely infatuated with the child. A short while later, Alice stood in front of the mirror in Susan's room. Susan had pinned her hair up in a style Alice had never seen, but she would make certain her sister showed her how to style her own hair that way later. It's perfect. Thank you, Susan. Susan smiled. My sister is about to be my daughter-in-law. I had to do my share. Alice just smiled. It's strange, I know, but I think it's going to work out. I hope so. Just don't expect a happily ever after from day one. You know, Elizabeth told me just the opposite. She told me if I expect to be happy, and I don't let myself concentrate on the bad stuff, I will be happy. I think I'm going to follow her advice. I think that our sister is very wise. Susan opened the door just a smidge, and they could hear voices from downstairs. I'd better get down there. I'll send little Oliver up to get you when it's time. Oliver was 6, and he'd be starting school soon, so he was the logical choice to send to do simple things in the house. The other children were in school, except for Clarissa and Annabel, who were all younger than Oliver. Alice took the time while she waited to pray, asking God to bless her marriage, both with feelings for her future husband and with many children. She wasn't yet finished when a knock sounded on the door. It's time for the wedding, Oliver told her. Alice got to her feet and slowly made her way down the stairs, spotting Albert at the bottom looking up at her. Someone was playing soft music on a piano, and she followed the music down to her groom, taking his hand as they stood before the minister. The wedding went by way too quickly for Alice. She'd wanted something she would always remember, and instead it was a 10-minute ceremony. When Albert was told he could kiss his bride, she turned her face up to his, offering her lips. The kiss was softer than the ones the night before, but it was full of promise, it seemed. A promise to treat her right. A promise of passion to come. A kiss of promise sealed their vows, and she felt hopeful for her future. Much food was set around, and people helped themselves to a small plate of it. The food was more finger food than anything else. Other than the cake, of course. Albert fed her a small bite of cake, and she returned the favor, much to the amusement of the guests. She met several different people and she felt as if she was the center of attention the entire time, which she had always said she didn't like, but she had to face facts. Part of the reason she'd been involved in so many pranks was because she loved when people were looking at her. As they mingled and she talked to people, Albert was always at her side, her hand in his. She felt stronger and more confident knowing he was there. One woman smiled at her. "You look so much like Susan did when she first came to Texas." Alice nodded. "Susan is my eldest sister. I barely remember her, though. She's been gone most of my life." "Oh, that explains everything. You really do favor one another." "I'll take that as a compliment, because I think Susan is beautiful inside and out." The woman smiled. "We're very happy to have you part of our little community." "Thank you, Mrs." Alice was certain the woman had given her name, but she couldn't for the life of her remember what it was. "Anderson. Philippa Anderson." "I'm very happy to be here, Mrs. Anderson." After Mrs. Anderson walked away, Albert whispered, "She's the biggest gossip in all of Texas. I'm certain she's off telling everyone that you're Susan's sister right now. Does that bother you?" "Not really. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm just telling you so you know for the future that if you don't want the world to know, Mrs. Anderson can't know." "Thank you. Anyone else I need to worry about?" she asked. Another woman came and introduced herself. "It's good to have you here. We all love Susan so much, and she'll be thrilled to have her own kin around." "How did you know Susan and I were kin?" Alice asked, wondering how quickly all of this would spread. "Oh, Mrs. Anderson told us all." "It wasn't a secret, was it?" "Of course not." Alice smiled sweetly, all the while wondering how many people already knew about her relationship with Susan. "I need a breath of fresh air." As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Albert led her toward the kitchen door and outside. "I'm so sorry," she said. "For what?" Albert looked confused. "I never meant for the whole world to know that Susan and I are sisters. I shouldn't have said anything. It doesn't bother me. That woman who just talked to us? She's the mother of the girl I wanted to marry. So now she'll go home and tell Sarah that we were childhood sweethearts, and we've been writing letters since we were old enough to hold pens. It will work in our favor, I'm certain. Are you sure you don't mind? He shook his head. Not one little bit. She stepped closer to him and wrapped her arms around him. Thank you. For what? He asked again. For just being you. I think we're going to have a wonderful life together. Of course, we are. By the time everyone was leaving, it was supper time, and Susan insisted they stay for the meal. There's time enough to start cooking tomorrow, she said, smiling. Alice nodded her thanks. We really appreciate it. I'm not sure I'm ready to learn to cook on a new stove today. Tomorrow is soon enough, Albert agreed. If he was anxious to get Alice home and alone, he didn't show it. Dinner was a particularly festive event that night, with even the small children realizing it had been a special day. After their prayer, Susan went around the table asking everyone what their favorite part of the day had been. Only little Clarissa was exempt as she was too young to talk beyond saying Mama and Dada. Some of the answers were sweet, and others were downright amusing. Louis said, I'm thankful to have received a new sister, who can give me advice about what ladies like. Oliver said, my favorite part was being in charge of getting Alice for the wedding. Susan looked perplexed. I'm trying to decide if the children should call you Aunt Alice, or if that will just make things more confusing. I think calling me Alice is just fine, Alice said. Good. I was starting to lose my mind, because if they called you Aunt Alice, then they'd have to call their own brother Uncle Albert, and then my brain would explode. Alice laughed softly. It's a good problem to have. David seemed pleased with how the day had gone as well. What do you keep smiling about, David? Susan finally asked. Alice had wanted to, but she wasn't sure how to start the conversation. Anderson came to me today to ask if I could break 2 new teams for him and his son. I'm excited to have new horses to work with. He's already chosen both teams, and I just need to get them ready. I should have known it was business, Susan said, shaking her head. One of these days you're going to be smiling at supper, and I'm going to ask, and you'll be happy one of the children did something. Hey, I'm proud of all 327 children. David protested. This time Alice had to ask. 300? Sure. Don't you think it has to feel that way at bedtime some days? I know it's how I feel most days, Susan said. I love all my children, but there are a lot of them. Oliver smiled. And we're all special in our own way, so a lot is a good thing, right, Mama? Right, Oliver. Susan reached over and squeezed her son's hand, and he smiled happily. You should come over while Albert is working tomorrow, Alice. I'm working on a couple of sewing projects, and I would love to have a sewing partner. I know you said you bought new fabric. Alice smiled, nodding. I'll do that for a couple of hours, but I don't want to start my marriage off by shirking my responsibilities. Glad to hear one of the demon horde has a good work ethic. We all do. Every one of us. Well, maybe not the youngest 4, because they're all still in school, but they're starting to quiet down. Even little Ida May hasn't been in trouble for months. Well, that's good news, Susan said. I do worry about all of them yet. I mean, how many siblings can Elizabeth realistically find spouses for? All of them, Alice said. She's amazing at what she does. People talk about her all the time. She's even gotten a couple of women in town out of bad situations. I'm sure she has. Doesn't she always? After the meal, they had more wedding cake, and then Albert and Alice went to the room she'd used to fetch her belongings to take to their own home. It feels so strange to me that we're married and settling in together, Alice said. But it also feels as if we should have done this months ago. I know exactly what you mean. It feels right, but odd, but right. That's exactly it. She looked up as they walked and smiled. It's a full moon tonight. Do you have any idea how happy looking up at the night sky makes me? I didn't, but I'm glad to know it. We'll have to take lots of walks late at night. He looked up at the sky, wondering why she was so fascinated with it. I tend to get up while it's still dark out, not stay up late enough to see the full moon. We'll have to make a habit of staying up late one night per week, just so we can watch the stars. Maybe on Saturday nights, because we won't have to be up as early for church as you do for work. She had to look down to make certain she was walking straight. Do you have any men working for you? I have 10. Not as many as I really need, but that's as many as we can afford right now. Soon we'll be able to hire more. I'm excited to say that the cattle we have are multiplying rapidly. We have lots of calves being born right now. Thanks to my men, I was able to take the entire day off to get married and be with my wife. I probably shouldn't have taken that much time, but it felt right. Then it was the right thing to do. I feel like God tells us when He wants us to do something, and that's why we feel such strong urges to do things we wouldn't normally think about. I like that, he said, opening their door wide. Now, I need to carry you over the threshold. But that was done to simulate the Roman men stealing the wives of the Sabine women. He shrugged. Doesn't matter to me. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her into the house, setting her on her feet just inside the door. Consider yourself carried. All right. She took her bags. I'm going to go use your wonderful bathroom and get ready for bed. Go milk a cow or something. I'll need 20 minutes to be ready. He groaned. Why didn't I just carry you into the bedroom and throw you on the bed? Because you're a civilized human being. That's why. Now go. Alice shut the bedroom door in his face to let him know she wasn't going to listen to any arguments. Even though she hadn't thought she was nervous about her wedding night, her heart was pounding at a much quicker rhythm than usual. It was all going to be fine though, because her new husband was a good man. Chapter 5. By the time Albert came back into the house, Alice was in bed, covered up completely, only her head sticking out from under the quilt. She was surprised at how nervous she was feeling now that the time had come. Albert turned down the lamp before shedding his own clothes and climbing into bed with her. You nervous? He asked, sounding surprised. She sighed. I didn't think I was, but now that it's come down to it, I am. I know it's silly. Not silly at all. This is a new experience for both of us. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nervous too. Really? Alice propped herself up on an elbow, squinting to see him by the light of the moon, which was streaming in through the open window. I know how much I like it when you touch me and kiss me, so I should just be eager for this to happen, and I was, but that eagerness seems to have slipped away. He sighed. All right. After a moment of quiet, he said, what if we just kiss, and if you don't want anything else to happen, that's all right. But if we find that we both want more, then it's all right to do more. Will that work? Alice nodded, already feeling better that he was willing to work with her through it. She didn't want to be a ninny, but she was feeling a bit like one at the moment. Albert rolled to his side facing her, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek, and he brushed his lips across hers, softly at first, but then with growing ardor. She stroked his shoulders, loving the feel of his bare muscles. He wasn't wearing a nightshirt, or anything else as far as she could tell, and she moved closer to him, wanting to feel him against her. She did so love his kisses, and she was certain that there was more she wanted to feel with him. Without saying anything, she pulled away and pulled her nightgown over her head, throwing the garment onto the floor. Albert stilled for a moment, but then his hand began exploring all the territory that had been covered by her nightgown. He cupped her breasts, playing with her nipples a bit until they turned into pebbles beneath his fingertips. He didn't do anything she hadn't given him permission to do, so when she rolled to her back and tugged him down atop her, he whispered, "Are you certain?" Alice nodded. Better make it quick before I change my mind again. He took her at her word, joining them much quicker than he should have and causing a gasp of pain to escape her lips. He was too far gone to care though, and while he moved into her over and over, he kept telling her he was sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm so sorry. The words were repeated the entire time he was inside her. When he rolled to his side, he put his arm over his face, knowing he hadn't done what was right by her. He was surprised when Alice rolled into his side and snuggled against him. You don't hate me? He asked. Of course not. Why would I hate you? He stroked her hair and her arm, trying to give her the kind of affection he should have shown earlier. If she didn't know why she should be upset, he certainly wasn't going to be the one to tell her. They lay there, letting the gentle night breeze from the window dry the sweat that soaked their skin as they faded into oblivion. Asterisk. Albert was the first to wake the following morning, but from what he'd heard about her trip, she would need a lot of sleep for a while to make up for the little sleep she'd gotten on her journey. He pulled his clothes on before sitting on the bed to wake her. Alice, he said softly. It's time to get up. She groaned, rolling over onto her side. Instead of getting up, she lay there for a moment and then sighed. I really need to catch up on my sleep someday, she said softly, swinging her legs to the side of the bed, only then seeming to realize she wasn't wearing anything. I'll start breakfast while you do the morning chores. She yawned loudly, needing another week in bed. She stood up, not paying attention to how he was watching her. Why would she worry about him seeing her with nothing on when he'd felt her that way the night before? Touch was more intimate than sight anyway. She found her bag and pulled out clothes for her day, and then looked behind her to where Albert was watching her dress. You all right? She asked. Yeah, I'm all right. Gotta work. With those words, he headed out the door and off to do his chores. Unsure what had just happened, Alice dressed and then went into the kitchen, noticing the icebox for the first time. Elizabeth had one in her home, but her family had never had one. It would be nice to keep food fresh for longer. Every modern kitchen should have one. She found eggs in the icebox, a few potatoes in the pantry, and she started cutting up the potatoes to make fried eggs and potatoes for breakfast. It had always been one of her favorite things growing up, and she hoped Albert would like it as much as she did. By the time Albert came back in with fresh eggs and a pail full of milk, Alice had the potatoes almost finished frying. Coffee or milk with breakfast? She asked. She'd planned to make a pot of coffee, even though she didn't drink it herself, but she hadn't been able to find a coffee pot. Just milk. I'm not really a coffee drinker. I've tried, but it just tastes too bitter for me. Alice smiled. Me too. I looked for a coffee pot to make it for you, but I was planning on having milk with my breakfast. And this is the reason that I'm sure we'll get along. He walked to her and kissed her softly. Now don't burn my eggs. She laughed. I'll do my best. Eggs are not my favorite thing to cook, but they're my favorite breakfast, so I need to figure them out. She flipped the fried potatoes onto 2 plates, and then started the eggs. What did you eat for breakfast before I came along? Whatever Mrs. H made. The only time I didn't eat at my parents' house was for the noon meal, and one of the men would make enough food for everyone. I'm not a cook at all. I can understand that, Alice said, flipping 2 perfect eggs onto the plate with his potatoes. She carried the plate to the table and then went back to fry her own. I'll be there in just a minute or two. He nodded, watching her work. It was odd to think they'd been strangers just 48 hours ago, and already it felt right to have her in his kitchen cooking his breakfast as if she'd done it a dozen times before. When she joined him, they bowed their heads for their prayer, and she said, I'm probably going to need to go to town for supplies soon. If we can wait until Saturday, I'll go with you. She stared at him blankly. I don't even know what day it is. He laughed. You got here on Tuesday, so today is Thursday. I'm sure we can wait 2 days. If all else fails, we'll eat at Susan's house. He shrugged. I would be all right with doing that, but I'd like us to quickly start being able to do things on our own without their help. Me too. Alice didn't like to think about being a burden on her sister and his father. It just didn't feel right. Good. I'm glad we agree. You'll probably have to start our kitchen garden in a couple of weeks. So early? She asked. What if there's a late freeze? We've only had one freeze so far this year, and that was in January. We should be just fine. All right. I'll talk to Susan about what grows well here. Could you plow a section of the yard so I can use it for my garden? He nodded. I won't do it myself, but I have a friend who will do it for you, and I'll give him some beef to make up for it. That sounds perfect, she said. She looked around her. The house was bigger than she'd expected, but there still wasn't a lot of cleaning to be done after what Susan and Mrs. H had done already. I'll spend part of the day with Susan. She wants us to sew together. After I get the dishes done, of course. Will you come home for lunch? He shook his head. Nope. I'll eat with my men. Sounds good. Alice wondered if she'd have a place in his life other than in his bed, but she didn't think it was the right moment to ask him that. He'd said in his letter he'd be working long hours, and she had agreed to it by writing him back. No, she couldn't start complaining about his hours just yet. Maybe next week. What time will you be home for supper? I'm usually done between 6:30 and 7, he told her. Perfect. He finished the last of his eggs and potatoes and stood up. I'll see you this evening. Don't go all demon horde on me and get into trouble while I'm gone. He dropped a kiss on her lips, and he was gone. Alice looked around thinking of how little she had to do and deciding she'd spend a little more time with her sister than she'd planned. After doing the dishes and sweeping up a little, there would be nothing else to do until it was time for her to cook supper. Being a housewife seemed to be very lonely work, something she'd never really realized before. After she'd made quick work of the chores, she unpacked the clothes that were still clean after her trip and put all her sewing into one carpet bag. It wasn't ideal to carry things around that way, but it was better than just walking to her sister's house with a needle, thread, fabric, and a pair of scissors. There was lots of shopping that needed to be done, and it wasn't all for food. On her way to Susan's house, she studied the land around her, wondering how far they were from the ocean. One of her favorite things about living in Beckham had been their proximity to the ocean. She knew Texas was on the Gulf Coast, but she had no idea how far from that coast she was. Texas was the very biggest state after all. She knocked on Susan's door, and Mrs. H opened it for her. You don't need to knock, Mrs. H told Alice. Your family. Come in. Come in. Alice stepped inside. Is my sister around? Mrs. H nodded. She's in the parlor, working on her sewing. I'll join her there. Good, good. Susan needs a sister to spend her time with. Mrs. H walked in the other direction, and Alice couldn't help but wonder where she was headed. It seemed like she was someone who spent her days in the kitchen, but Alice knew she did other things around the house as well. Stepping into the parlor, she saw her sister on the sofa, painstakingly ripping out a seam. I hate sewing, Susan said softly. I don't remember that. You were little. I didn't mind it when I was making pretty dresses for myself, but constantly sewing for my children becomes tedious very quickly. Susan held up the garment in her hands. The twins can't seem to keep from tearing their clothes. I found it easier if I just remove the entire seam and restitch it. Mrs. H would do it, but I feel like she already does too much for my children. Isn't that what you pay her for? Alice asked. She didn't quite understand her sister's reasoning. Susan smiled. When I first came here, Mrs. H was a nurse for the children, and she cooked the meals. That's all she was expected to do. Over the years, she's had to do more and more. We work together, and we enjoy each other's company, but I really don't think I should ask her to do more than she already does. She seems very happy to be here, Alice said, taking the pieces of the pattern her mother had cut out for her out of her bag. I only have 3 dresses, and I have a feeling those won't be enough here. I need to make at least 3 more, and I purchased fabric for all 3, but now the real work begins. I enjoy sewing, but I hate cutting out the pieces. I always think my scissors will slip, and I'll make a huge mess that I won't be able to fix. Susan smiled. I feel the same way. Always have. I've messed up a few dresses as well. I need to mend this dress for the twins, and then I need to make a new dress for Annabelle. Hers is getting so short on her, it's indecent. Alice laughed. She's a little girl. Nothing is indecent on her. You'd think. But the other women at church keep telling me she needs longer dresses, so I'm making her longer dresses. I don't want people talking about my little girl or my parenting skills or lack thereof. You'd be surprised at how many gossips we have in our church. Alice groaned. Sounds like the church back in Beckham. Someone was always telling Ma that she was an unfit mother. And Ma was always ignoring them. Susan smiled. I was one of those telling her it was time to take a switch to her younger children, but she never listened to me or anyone else for that matter. Alice shrugged. We all turned out all right, even without regular switching. Susan nodded. That you have.